Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote podcast.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the CTA podcast. We're glad to have you as our guests. And if you just landed on our channel, this is our fourth installment in a series of discussions that we have on the book Bad Therapy: Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up by Abigail Shrier. I don't know about you two, but after reading this book, I have actually taken a bit of a bird's eye view on my own practice to just see to what extent I have inadvertently been influenced by this culture of softness and of accommodation, hesitation to not stir the pot too much, reluctance to confront. You know, and I have to say that it has impacted my position in the therapeutic space as well. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on it?
I completely agree. Interestingly, I had a
Mm.
conversation with somebody at a dinner party that I was at just a few weeks ago, and she was discussing, this woman I met was discussing how a friend of hers was in therapy with her daughter, and that the therapist was so soft and so
Mm.
gentle. There wasn't any, confrontation or any kind of assertive suggestions of looking at what the role that they each play in creating the conflict. There was just so much hand holding and stroking
Mm.
of the daughter in particular, the girl. And her mom have had this sort of rocky relationship over, the past several years. And this woman was asking me what is happening in therapy that is leading to these kinds of outcomes, where I would expect the therapist to have gently challenged them a bit rather than coddle and, in a sense, be so affirmative or affirming that they're not moving forward. They're both kind of sticking in their positions, heels dug into that ground, the child especially, where the mom tends to be a little bit more accommodating. And
Mm.
so it got me to thinking about this idea of this over affirmation. And we talk about it with gender, right? And the transgender children that we're, providing gender affirming care, that we are obviously talking about being a huge problem. But I don't think it's just about the transgender kids. It really extends to all facets of
Yes.
therapy, and especially when we're talking about therapy with kids. So
Yes.
that's what really got me to think about how poignant some of those remarks actually are that Abigail makes in the book. I don't agree with everything, but there are some poignant messages that I'm seeing as a trend that even people who are not therapists are asking me about their experience in therapy or knowing somebody who's in therapy. So I thought
Yeah.
that was just a really fascinating opportunity for my own self-reflection.
Mhm,
Michael, what do
Yeah.
you
mhm.
think?
I think as far as it pertains to my work, I'm always curious about what kind of implicits we're putting onto our work when we're with a client, when we choose not to engage with particular material that might come up in the session. Maybe, to the extent that it makes us feel uncomfortable or uncertain if it'll do something to damage the relationship. And the reason I think that that's what comes up for me here is that for Schreier, what she's describing here in chapter 9,
Mm.
discussing parents and their desire to maintain this pristine relationship with their children at times, that they're inadvertently abdicating the responsibility to provide the benefit of experience and of their wisdom to their kids in the hopes that they might not cause conflict and to maintain relational harmony. And so in that sense, I did see it related to my work at when are the times when I'm working with a client where something comes up, and even though it feels like it's important for us to go there, I myself maybe don't make the decision to go there, or I'm uncertain, so I leave it. I leave it for a moment because, of course, relational harmony is a big part of what we do in terms of a trusting rapport and relationship with our clients. So I saw the juxtaposition there for sure. And what are
Yeah.
the things that parents aren't addressing with their kids now for fear that they might be harming the relationship?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the clients that we're seeing are also clients that find themselves, uh, that they find themselves rooted in this culture, in this coddling culture. So I think initially it might be a bit of a shock to them if you just confront them right away. So obviously you need to respect the process. But we also know that confrontation is necessary for psychological growth and for psychological healing, because you need to shed light on some, ultimately psychopathology is a process of self-deception. So you need to shed light on forms of self-deception so that the person can adequately resolve those, whatever is keeping those forms of self-deception alive. So to your point, I think healing psychotherapy may feel to some people as not coddling enough, but if they stick it through, healing psychotherapy will be healing. They will see a strengthening of ego, better coping, and even resolution of whatever was keeping them stuck. But let's go into depth if it's okay.
Yes,
the road
certainly.
paved by gentle parents. Gosh, I don't know.
Yes.
Again, I don't know about you guys, but my countertransference, my frustration with some of these stories, I was like, I'm so glad. I'm so glad I'm not a kid anymore. And I'm so glad I was raised by the parents who raised me. They were not perfect. And we've been through rough times, but thank goodness I've not been raised by some of these parents.
Yes.
So
I would have to agree.
Yeah. So what I like about Abigail Shrier is she actually she relates stories, interviewing parents, interviewing their style of interaction with their children. And because it's a good faith interview, you can see how these parents drop their parenting styles, they reveal their parenting styles. And you can just see where the problem lies. You know, it is gratification-based parenting. Gentle parenting is gratification-based parenting because anything that causes discomfort is deemed to be harmful. And if it's harmful, it needs to be avoided. So what's left? Gratification. And then they don't understand why the kids can't handle structure while they crave structure. And of course they'll protest structure. Of course they'll protest gratification, the deprivation of gratification. Of course they will. But that is what good parenting does. So yeah, so one of the things that I wrote here was many of these parents are very scared to be seen as the bad object by their children. They want to be popular in the eyes of their children. That's why they want to be gentle parents and just coddle, 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 coddle. Yeah.
Michael, I'm interested in are there things that you didn't necessarily agree with in this particular chapter or that you had a hard time with? I'm really curious about that.
If there were things, I think throughout the chapter, I noticed, I felt much more of her involved in the chapter than I did maybe previously. I think I got intimations of that in the previous chapter, that more of her reaction towards the stories that she was hearing were bubbling to the surface. Just by virtue of just some of the commentary that she was making and her willingness to essentially lay out an overall thesis here in the chapter, which maybe we can get into. But something that I think stood out to me is we've kind of moved away from maybe was what felt like the best of journalistic intentions, a little more into her world as she's reflecting on herself as a parent. And so I'm thinking about myself just as a person, but as a clinician, and the bubbling up of that counter-transferential reaction to the material as it's coming your way. And I'm thinking, man, as a journalist, how do you maintain that neutral frame, hearing these stories for such a long time? And Jaco, to your point, almost wanting to pull your hair out, going, this is not working. We poked holes in the ship here that we were trying to make sure stayed afloat. And if I can, I wrote down something of my own that I was planning on sharing here, is that what I heard Shrier described here, at least one of the things she described, was something along the lines of, we have this cohort of parents that were raised by a group of parents that maybe they either felt or they were told later on were disempowering to them. That was the sense I got from her. And so the culture shifted around this belief or this consensus that at one point parents were just not as emotionally available, or in some sense not even physically available. Maybe they were working, maybe they weren't always there to keep an eye on the kids. And so as this overcorrection, an overcorrection may have taken place here, where those same children who felt disempowered or were told they were disempowered as children, when they became parents, tried to give a tremendous amount of negotiating power to their children when they were raising them, in the hopes that they might have a better relationship, or they might alleviate any suffering that they themselves felt they experienced later on, in hindsight perhaps. And ironically became disempowered parents, is what I hear her describing. They ironically re-inhabited this role of this disempowered and, in some ways, still emotionally unheard individual that is now afraid to command that power, to step into that role, for fear that they might re-incur some sort of injury that they had with their own children, and this fear that they will just repeat this series of injuries. Which I have great questions, especially when somebody gives me a story in retrospect, if they're coloring their experience through the cultural norms as they evolved across time. Did you actually have that as your perceptual experience at the time? Did you actually feel neglected? Did you feel disempowered? Did you feel hurt? Or have narratives bubbled up to the surface that have, in some sense, coded and texturized your remembering? Are you remembering it in a way that's different to how you experienced it initially? So that was what was coming up for me throughout the chapter.
Look, she had her own therapy herself.
Yes.
Right.
And she also reflects, right, even in the beginning of the book, she reflects on how they raised their children. It was also quite therapeutic in the way they raised their children. So it's almost like she had her experience with psychotherapy. She had her experience with almost psychotherapeutic parenting. It's almost like she got disillusioned, but I think she started to realize that there's something serious wrong with the way we're parenting our children. And what is going on here? And because she's a journalist and because she speaks to so many parents, I think she really gets a bird's eye view of what is going on. Not only parents, but also obviously also academics. And we can all sense this cultural trend, not only of disempowered, or I call them disorientated parents, but also disorientating and disempowering parents, because those children aren't being empowered. Because that is what the parents convey. Please, Christine.
I agree. And I have to say that I found myself, when I told this story a couple of minutes ago about my interaction with this particular woman, I found myself being very disillusioned by the field and the direction the field of therapy is going in. I didn't actually defend therapy. I actually thought about it as a whole and kind of came to this conclusion that overall, this is the direction that we're going, and this is the new narrative that we're writing. So I actually found myself explaining to her that this was an overall issue in the field as a whole, whether we're dealing with kids or we're dealing with adults, we're dealing with perversions. I always think of you when I think of that word.
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Bring the P word back.
Hopefully in the most
Right.
professional sense.
In the most
yes, well,
sense, of course. And the fact that the over affirmation and the search for microaggressions, another topic that came up for me this week when I was doing another I was running a support group actually for Solid Ground, and this idea that people are even searching for points at which they are hurt and inadvertently hurt by something that's not intentionally harmful and in no way meant to actually be an insult or an injury, but that people are becoming so weakened, I guess, by all of this, that they're not able to let things kind of roll off your back, for lack of a better term. There is no brushing it off, dusting it off, and going forward. I mean, that and in the field as a whole, I think is a direction that I've seen us move into, which is where all of these kind of fringe groups that want all of this validation start popping up, right? It's a ripe hotbed for the fringe groups that we see on the very, very extreme far, either left or right, the very extremist progressives on both ends, that these these fringe groups are gaining a lot of fuel and a lot of steam. And part of that has to do with the culture that's created around all of this affirmation that's happening, whether it's children or adults. So I found myself sort of saying, you know, these are my issues with what I'm feeling as a clinician and what I'm seeing as a clinician. And this is where I start to have some trouble with my own countertransference, let's say, in not being in thinking, not in not being as supportive of my colleagues as I would like to be, both colleagues that I know and the colleagues that I don't know, but the actions that are taking place in those therapy rooms. So
Yeah.
that's where I landed with it. Yeah.
I think what you're describing here is this bidirectional relationship that maybe is getting left out of the book a little bit, at least from my view, where therapy and therapy culture, let's just say, they're obviously not divorced from one another, but culture generally is not divorced from kind of the norms of the therapy field. We are also human beings immersed in our own culture, walking around and being influenced by it to some degree, having reactions to it to some degree. And I think part of what you're describing, at least for me, is that difficulty in supporting some of our colleagues in the field is when a clinician, when a therapist, when a psychologist, mental health professional allows culture to over-inform their activities to the point that it is detrimental to any approach that they might take with somebody, or even if they don't even give any conscious thought to it, that's a really dangerous spot to be in, where we have become cultural avatars walking into a room or writing something thinking that we're coming at it with the best of intentions or with the best expertise in mind, foregoing theory, foregoing anything that we may have learned, a lot of which has been thrown under the bus in the last few years, as being representative of something oppressive, let's just say. Once we're in that position, it does become really hard to support our field, and it becomes really easy to read something like this and say, you know what, therapy has absolutely caused this problem, and forget that there is a relationship there. There is a relationship. And perhaps what we're not doing is creating enough of an immune system within our field to say, when something is encroaching upon our work, it has the potential to change the way we do things that also informs the culture again, in that bidirectional sense.
Yeah. And if you think about it, psychology, psychotherapy is meant to shed light on what is unthought of, unspoken, repressed, maybe even resisted. And this needs to be done not only on an individual level, but also on a cultural level. But just think about the language that has been used in connection with our field. It's often described as progressive. So we already see this bias of novelty. In other words, we can only progress. Whatever develops can only be an improvement. Is that true? Is that true? Are you saying that 1938 is later than the 1500s, and therefore what happened in Germany in 1938 is an improvement on what happened in the 1500s? Because it is in terms of chronology more progressive. You see, and this is the types of biases that are built in our language that shapes our language, that shapes our world, and with the shaping of our world also has its own set of blind spots that we need to scrutinize and interrogate.
Well,
and I'm not one to spare a field just because we want to spare feelings. This is a very responsible field. It is occupied by people who are very powerful. It's a person's mind, it's a person's life that's in your hand. So obviously, with responsibility comes accountability. So I am one for scrutinizing what we observe, as opposed to just, I don't know, being gentle with our field.
And ethically, we have a responsibility. Ethically, we have a responsibility that when we see, even if it's uncomfortable for us, and perhaps most importantly, when it is, when we see things heading in a negative direction, there's a potential for harm because the group's activities have started to head in a direction that they deem as positively progressive, let's just say.
Yeah.
We have an obligation to say something about it, or at least to question it when we're unsure. And I think one of the norms that has taken place for us is the chilling effect of what if I do say something about this, if the group turns to me and sees me as kind of an aberrant professional, then I need to really just shut my mouth and stop saying what I'm saying. But again, we have an ethical responsibility to say, to point out when the field is maybe misstepping. And it makes me wonder, do we have an ethical responsibility to also listen to when somebody says the field is misstepping?
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
Absolutely. And I think there's a parallel here between when do we tell clients that they're done with therapy? Part of, I think, all of this as well is that we as therapists, I don't know about the two of you, but it's an uncomfortable conversation when the client wants to continue to go. We see that maybe there's improvement. We see that this is an opportunity for them because they have been empowered, because they have learned some tools, right? They've learned how to move through the world. They have a sense of awareness now that they can actually use to inform decision making and moving forward. And we know that going forward in therapy, there's going to be a block there. There is such a thing as going too far or not being needed anymore, right? When do we actually turn to the client and say, okay, I know this is a hard conversation to have, and we've built such a wonderful relationship and rapport here, but I think it's time to consider termination. I don't know one therapist currently who has been the instigator of, or the initiator of termination, of saying it's time, that this is no longer going in any direction. You've reached what we can do together. The rest now is the way you take that and move through your life and the way you move in the world. And that's something that I think is very hard to do, and that I see a lot of.
And in a way, it is so profound when you broach the topic, when you tell your client or your patient, saying, you've been coping well, you came to therapy and these were your aims. It looks like you're well on your way. We need to think about termination. It shows that you've recognized their progress. It is such a conveying of confidence in your client when you say things like those, and it's painful. I mean, it's a type of a detachment. But remember, right from the beginning, that attachment wasn't possessive; it's non-possessive attachment. So there is a detachment that we're feeling, not only us as therapists, but also obviously the clients too. But it can be so transformative. So let's get back to the chapter.
Sure.
Yes.
I want to mention something, and that is, I love. By the way, I like these tangents. By the way.
Oh yes.
I want to highlight this one experience that she relates of this father who wrote a book, Raising Rafi. He's a Harvard-educated writer. What stands out to me was the extreme sensitivity with which he raised this boy. It was a difficult boy, sensitive, but also explosive. But also the apologetic way with which he did it, how groveling he was when he didn't please his boy. And as a parent, sometimes you will not please your child. You need to do what is right, not what is nice, always. And there's one point here where she writes, when Rafi tells him, you're a bad dada and I'm never going to listen to you again, Gessen despairs. Now that's the father, Gessen. I felt he was right. I was not a good dada, but I didn't know what else to do. And here you see Abigail Shrier's own personality shine through, where she says, you almost want to shake Gessen and tell him what no parenting book will. Rafi wants someone to take charge, someone other than the 3-year-old boy himself. It makes him angry to see his father debase himself with so much therapeutic arabesque and high-minded flummox. It makes Rafi want to punch his father in the nose because that little boy needs a father, most importantly for his own sake, but also for the sake of the kids, he slugs at the park.
Mm.
And I mean, we as psychoanalysts, we understand that, when you, especially when you go through the Oedipus process, you end up with a kind of a superego.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the way it is. You can't escape developing a superego. Either your superego is so unstructured and therefore harsh, chaotic, cruel, and you'll see it in that child, or your superego has been structured by society, by family members, by dad, by parents. So you will feel, as you grow older, you will feel a sense of force being imposed upon you from the superego. You can't escape the force being imposed upon you.
Mm-hmm.
That force is either structured, predictable, reasonable, because your parents were that way, or your parents were so scared, they were scared of your aggression. I mean, they reveal it when they want to please you all the time, just so that we don't unleash the little monster. In which case, you will sit with a harsh, chaotic, unpredictable superego, and you'll see it in the person's behavior and even the person's personality development. You can't escape it.
I think as we see the authority figures, this again, that abdication of being this externalized, this new superego in some sense coming in, we're the authorities, and we will tell you how to parent. Being adopted by these parents in lieu of what maybe are actually their better instincts or their better intuitions about what their child needs. You almost see this transference of this anxious parenting, where and being transposed and being moved to the child without any organization or any structure for a child to scaffold from, to lean on or rely on. You can almost see the uncertain parent who got a kid with no rule book attached to them in the beginning, trying to rely on a rule book that is generalized and vague and non-specific to their child, and then not knowing what to do, maybe not doing anything in some cases, and the child is disorganized and all over the place. I think she captured that quite nicely. When you have a parent who's completely anxious and unsure about what to do, it leaves the child in the exact same position, and chaos can ensue.
That child internalizes that disorientation.
Mm.
You see that.
It just, I'm thinking here about when I used to work with grief. I worked at a grief support center for several years in the earlier part of my career. And, we had people who were coming in. We served adults and children. So the children that came in, their parent had died, and we'd run these groups and whatnot for support and all of that. But the amount of times that we would actually sit down and tell the parent, your child doesn't need therapy. Your child's parent has died, and they're going to have a lot of feelings, or they may not show those feelings, or they may not access them. Any kind of expression of that from one continuum to another is perfectly reasonable and what we might expect to see from kids, especially when they don't tend to experience strong feelings of grief until about a year or so after the parent has died, depending on the age, because it takes them a while for the reality and the concreteness of the end of never permanence to actually settle in. And so we were turning away parents constantly, and the parents thought we didn't want to help. They thought we didn't want to help their kid. The people in this scenario who actually did need the support, and the parents, if you'll take a guess here, it wasn't the kid, it was actually the parents, because it was they themselves that could not manage and could not tolerate seeing their children in despair. And they thought if they can come on in and just sort of dump their kids off, then that would be the solution. And that was something that, and those parents themselves are just a wreck. It's their partner or spouse who died, usually, if it's the kid's parent. So they themselves are in complete chaos, and they had a hard time seeing the forest through the trees. But they were the ones who effectually needed the actual support and needed the help, because they couldn't. But tolerate seeing their children in any sort of despair. And maybe I think this jumps ahead to the next chapter, but this idea of wanting to either medicate or therapize feelings away because you can't tolerate watching them or seeing your child experience them becomes detrimental to the kid down the line. And in those cases, the kid acts out, or the kid ends up becoming a people pleaser, so to speak, and doesn't want to upset mommy or daddy because mommy or daddy get upset when I'm upset. So now we've put all of these sort of expectations and raised them from being the children that they are to now needing to wear these adult, these adult roles and fill shoes of the person who died. So it just kind of brings me back to that whole concept of being able to tolerate discomfort and distress and still keeping the boundary with your child, still being able to keep the structure, still keeping consequences. I mean, that was a big deal too, that we would kind of the parents would want to maybe lift consequences and give their kids a free pass if they were punching, little Jimmy's punching, Susie at school every day because of this horrible tragedy they've been through. So let's just let that go because, little Jimmy's having some trouble. Let's throw him into therapy, right? So it didn't work. And repeatedly, this is what we kind of face. So it just helps me link together some of the things that I experienced in my own practice, working with a very specific type of therapy, which was specific to grief, essentially, to death.
Yeah.
Do we feel these movements have had an effect of an inadvertent parentification for children, that by creating a void in the family system, by creating this space where parents are no longer necessarily putting their putting their foot down, that we're relying on kids to, as you said, Christine, what kind of triggered that for me was this notion of, if mom or dad gets anxious, if a caretaker gets anxious, I must regulate myself. The child's not thinking about it in these terms, but I must calm down or take care of myself so that I take care of them, so that I make sure that they don't feel anxious. And so I could imagine a kid kind of clamming up and trying to clamp down on their emotional experience in an ironic fashion, as opposed to self-expression and being, even though there's this therapized approach, this gentle parenting at play, there's also the possibility for a kid to see that and say, you know what, I'm not going to actually express myself or learn to deal with my emotions in a positive way. And I could see a whole host of maladaptive coping strategies being employed just to manage that, just to get through a day.
Absolutely. They're either withholding and suppressing, or they're out punching Susie. And redirecting
Poor Susie.
Right. And redirecting so that they don't.
Sorry, Susie.
It's easy. Yes. And that, I mean, poor Susie's just getting hit left and right at this point. But, that takes away some of that, mom is not okay. And I need to do something that kind of takes mom out of the not okay feeling. And that now she can be angry at me for being a bad girl or a bad boy or whatever it is. There's also some projection that I think is happening in those cases, where it becomes easier to be the bad kid and the focus to be on that than it is for the focus to be on watching their own parent suffer because they themselves are not able to manage doing two things at once, suffering and parenting at the same time. So it goes in either direction. I mean, many directions, but
those kids are uncontained.
When you're uncontained,
when you're uncontained, you feel unsafe. There is no containment, not within themselves, nor within their role models, because their parents are uncontained. Their parents are anxious and uncertain about themselves. So what does an uncontained child do? They regress to almost a paranoid state. When they're uncontained, everything feels dangerous to them. And they want to avert the danger all the time. That's why they're so sensitive. They can't contain and process and manage their own emotions. So what do? They evacuate, they discharge their emotions.
Yes.
And it brings relief. It is so nice to finally get rid of these emotions. But they've just pummeled poor Susie again.
Yes. Again. Right.
And that becomes the norm. And the more
Yes.
aggressive they become, the more defeated the parents become. It's just a vicious cycle.
Yes. Yes.
And there's this expectation that the child should be an adult, like you say. This one subheading. Anyone have advice about how to get a 3-year-old to accept the consequences?
Mm-hmm. What did you think about that?
There's about 50 things wrong with this sentence of 9 words. I mean, it's so bizarre. It's so bizarre. You shouldn't even comment on this. That is how bizarre it is. But that just shows the extent of alienation from what is natural. You mentioned grief, for instance. She goes into anxiety and depression.
Mm-hmm.
How many times have I heard someone telling me in bereavement, when is this pain going to end now?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You were married how long?
Right. Right.
You loved your wife how long?
Yeah.
She was your darling. You have how many memories?
Yeah.
Such good memories. You've gone through so much.
Yep.
You've been seeing me for 4 months, and you're like, when's this pain going to go away now?
Yes.
No.
And I think she points out that depression and anxiety, which have really been relegated to monsters in our experience as human beings, have an adaptive quality to them.
Mm-hmm.
That we are supposed to be in touch with these feelings. Such
That's
that
a nice segue into chapter 5. I mean, into chapter 10, if you want to
10.
continue. Yes.
Yes. And just, there seem to have been a number of rhetorics throughout our field, one of which being that depression and anxiety are some sort of biological hiccup that's occurring inside the person, that it's endogenous, it's an internal experience happening at some sort of biological level, and that we aren't reacting to our circumstances necessarily. And a lot of the time when we're talking to somebody who is experiencing something like anxiety or depression, there are external circumstances that we can at least point to that either exacerbate their experience in a way that pushes them into a intense form of dysfunction, let's say. And if they are pointed out, these experiences, we can start to reconcile with them and understand what effect they're having on us. I think what she described in chapter 10, as we've moved into more of this medicalized psychiatric way of managing these symptoms, we have prioritized muting those emotions as opposed to trying to understand what the genesis of them are. And again, it kind of ties in with the last chapter, because to some degree, if you have given up the role to some degree to the experts, it would make sense that when you send somebody off to an expert and they're handed a pill and they seem to be behaving differently, maybe better in your eyes, that you would automatically assume, well, yeah, it was something internal to my kid. Clearly, it can't be my parenting. It can't be something that I was doing. It can't be the circumstance. It can't be the situation that's happening at school, or just a natural course of development, something my child's going through that they themselves can't reconcile with. It must have been something internal. And I think we have to start getting a better grip on having a balancing act on that conversation. And not laying it solely at the feet of something we can't see.
Yeah. So it is important to ask the question, how do we approach symptoms? And if symptoms are unwanted manifestations we just want to get rid of, we've missed the message. Because symptoms are always a message. Symptoms are extremely valuable. And the medicalization of psychology is at the root of this. It's unwanted. You get rid of the symptom. The person is coping enough. They're not depressed anymore. They're not anxious anymore. They're zombified after a few electroconvulsive therapy sessions, and a cocktail of pills. They're zombified. The child sits still, is no longer playing, but at least is not disruptive of the class. Okay. But there's no understanding of what the symptom was actually trying to convey. And the symptom is crucial in understanding the psyche. You mentioned something else. You said our environment. And I wonder if you've noticed the contradiction in the general discourse of environment. In some settings, the environment is always to blame, right? External locus of control, especially in identity politics. The environment is always to blame. There's nothing inherently wrong with my with my addiction. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm addicted because my environment, right? When it comes to children and the medicalization of children, because children want to be children, because they protest their environment, it's never the environment. It's always them. They need to be medicalized. You see the contradiction?
Absolutely.
It's never the parents. It's never the parents either. Right? And we don't, sorry, I don't want to slag the parents here, because I know 99.5%, 0.5, the other 0.4% are problematic. But 99.5% of all parents just want the best for their children.
Absolutely.
I get that. I get that. But it does become frustrating when we keep on doing the same thing and we expect a different outcome when we see it's not working. And it's okay. It's okay to fail your child from time to time. You know, something, you know, I can't say it in English because English isn't structured this way. But I'm going to try to translate. Something only becomes valuable. I'm translating from my own language now. Something only becomes valuable if you've experienced the possibility of losing it.
Sure.
And parents who want to be too good parents deprive their children of the possibility of the experience of that possibility of losing their parents. And that experience is crucial for children to appreciate their parents. So failure is necessary. And if that child interprets your limit setting as failure, then so be it.
Right.
You will contain your child, and your child will appreciate you because they've experienced the possibility of losing you as a parent.
Yes.
And that is the root of appreciation, of gratitude.
Yes.
So this thing of medicalization, of medicating your child into compliance, into not being natural, not being normal, is not a solution.
What is the solution?
Well, we can only think about approximating the solution. And approximating the solution is to just she says this right at the end. I like what she said right at the end. She says, the expert trained us to see our children as they did, objectively. We began measuring our kids against an ideal the expert set for attention or agreeableness or pliability to a teacher's wishes, as if conformity to a teacher's wishes were the best measure of our little girl or boy. I don't know how to raise your kid, but you do.
Yes.
So I think what she's trying to say is maybe tone down the noise from experts. Maybe connect to your gut. Maybe connect to your own memory of the way you were raised. Remember what worked. Remember what did not work. And be courageous in applying those lessons in raising your child. Get some confidence back. And if confidence means relying on your instinct again, then you do that. And I'm saying it as a clinical psychologist. I mean, you guys are all therapists as well. And I think that gives us the sense to reorientate our parents again. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of, it goes back to the idea that, when kids are put into therapy, usually they're not the issue. Usually the issue is the structure at home or lack of structure at home, whatever the case may be, but it's the dynamic of the entire family, right? It's kids go to therapy because their parents are having the issue, their parents in some way. And it's not to do all of this blaming parents. It's very hard to be a parent, which I completely understand. I'm not a parent, so I'm not sitting here saying that, oh gee, it's easy to do this. But as a trained professional, and from what I understand about child and adolescent development, family systems, that type of structure, oftentimes the kids are in therapy because something in the family unit isn't working. There's something in that dynamic between whoever those parents are, whether it's a legal guardian or it's whoever's in charge of raising the child. Okay, we'll say, because there's mixed families now all the time in different conglomerations. Whoever's responsible, typically the issue isn't with the child. They throw the child into therapy, but the issue is with something that's happening, like the dynamic at home. Oftentimes the power structure is imbalanced. Oftentimes there's no structure at all, or a structure that makes sense. There's structure that might be too rigid, that doesn't give breathing room for independence or for children to make mistakes and fail and understand what it feels like to stand up again after failing, whatever the case may be. So when parents are putting their kids in therapy at these like record numbers that we see, I don't think it's a bad idea. It kind of begs the question, what is happening in your household? What is happening with you that is creating this kind of result that leads you to put your child in therapy, where you expect that it's the child that needs to get better, when really it's the family that needs to get better, and really it's the dysfunction of the greater unit. I don't know if you've all read The Family Crucible. It's one of those books that's highly, right? So the example in the family there, they didn't even want the kids in the room at one point. Initially, the family therapy was, let's have the adults in the room and we'll bring in the kids as necessary, right? And the idea behind that was because the therapists there were trying to get to the root of what was dysfunctional in the relationship between the mom and the dad in this case. I'm talking more broadly about other kinds of, structures of families and homes. But so when she says that you know what to do, I think that's very empowering for parents to understand that it's actually within their hands. It's actually something that needs to change within the structure that they've created, whether that structure is rigid, whether that structure has porous boundaries, limited boundaries, healthy boundaries, not healthy, whatever the case may be. There's something there. So that's what I sort of gleaned from the ending of that chapter, and her trying to re-empower parents to be actual parents, right? Not to be friends, not to be, coddlers, none of that. Even, she even talked about overpraising children, right? When we give them too much praise for doing things that are basic expectations of behavior that we should expect to see in them, that we overpraise that. And these kids, and I've mentioned this in many of these podcasts before, it's the idea that everybody gets a trophy in the classroom when it's not merit-based. So this overpraising, well, gosh, I did all my homework. Why shouldn't that just immediately allow for me to go to the play corner of the room and not have to participate in class? I did everything you wanted me to do. So now I get a vacation. I get to party, right?
It's that praise paradox.
It's the praise paradox.
It's demoralizing.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And, I wonder if part of the issue in trying to, part of our work is always trying to suss out in some ways the underlying root cause. And I think it's part of a human inclination, an instinct to try and find kind of what the actual explanation is. When it comes to human beings, we're talking about an extremely complex set of inputs, if you will. And if we were to blame society, we would be missing out a huge part of the picture. If we were to blame the child, we'd be missing a huge part of the picture. If we were to blame just the parents, if we were to blame just the therapist. And I think that if we don't start to get comfortable with trying to bring a full view together, when you're conceptualizing a client, you never assume that the conceptualization is just it's done. You've got it perfectly right, and you know everything that you can know about this person, because the unbelievable complexity of a human being whose story is continuing to be written on a day-to-day basis. If I have a 20-year-old client, I have 20 years of history to catch up with, and more history to catch up with as time flows on. If I don't see them for a week, 6 to
So
7
good.
days have gone by, new history for me to catch up on, and I have to
Yes.
reconceptualize the person. 1 week, what might be salient for them might be culture. The next week, what might be salient for them might be their parents. There's just too much rich complexity to boil somebody down to any of these features alone.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think if you asked me earlier if there was something I might have disagreed with in this
Yes.
chapter, and I think the felt sense I had was we can't keep reducing and boiling things down to just the parents, just the culture, just the child, without seeing how they interact and interrelate with one another. We have
Brilliant.
to be more sophisticated than that, and it's hard. It takes effort, and it takes us consistently challenging not just the other person, but our own preconceptions about what we know
Sure.
about that
That's
individual.
brilliant.
Yeah, it's like the goldfish, the goldfish not realizing that it's in water.
Yes.
I mean, the things we assume to be true, especially value laden things like parenting. Parenting is value laden. I mean, it's such a moral relationship. So it is truly understandable, and that also makes it difficult because parents want to be better. I can't say it any better than the way you did, Michael. It
Absolutely.
is complex, and it's a mixture of contributions. It's a
Certainly,
mixture of
yeah.
and also shifting contributions all the time that one needs to navigate.
And in one's
I
home, you're doing your best simulated enactment of learning the skills required, whether they're explicit or not, that will make you adaptive and flexible out in the
Yeah.
world. And if you run up against something in the world, it's nice to have a place to come back to where you can process through that, understand that in whatever form it shows up. And it may not always be what feels like a positive experience at the time, but it might be what you need.
And
and
the home
I
is the training ground. Sorry, the
yes.
home is the training grounds to
Yes.
prepare kids for the world out there.
Yes.
The world the world out there is not your nana's lap. There are
No.
opportunities to relax. There are opportunities to please yourself and to have fun. But by and large, the world out there is harsh, and you need this skill. And just because it's harsh doesn't mean it's fun to be in this
Yes.
harsh world. It's amazing. It's amazing enough because you also reflect on yourself and you see the challenges that you've gained mastery over. It's amazing to be able to do that.
Yes.
And schools, families, it might be valuable. You ask, so what's better parenting? What's the solution? To just keep this in mind. That try and it is artificial because, like I said, these are the training grounds for the world out there. But try and introduce certain challenges in the home environment where it's still safe to fail, where the child can be encouraged to try again and again and again and again to gain certain skills, interpersonal skills, their own physical skills, so that they're better equipped to deal with the challenges on the outside.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the bigger complaints or critiques of the book. And Michael and I were talking about this too, Jaco. What you said, Michael, essentially, is that she sort of, as a whole, I think in the book in general, if we look at what we're going to critique in a way that could have been improved, is she kind of flattens the role that culture plays in what's happening with these children, right? That's kind of flattened, and the focus is solely on parents. So this idea that you're taking a more holistic approach, Michael, like looking at the culture and how the interplay of that comes into the space, that's not really addressed in the book at all, not in any meaningful way. So the complaints I've heard about the book or critiques from people that were parents actually was that they felt blamed, and that she was blaming them to the extent that there wasn't any acknowledgement of the interplay of multiple factors that they're juggling, or that we're all juggling, that are societal, cultural, and then the rise of these identity politics that have been a complete nightmare. All of those things at work are also part of the problem. So I do want to sort of say that I think what you're talking about is important to note, because it's something that she doesn't really talk about in the book, but has very significant influence on what's happening with the kids in general.
And this is a common reflex, I think, when
Yes.
parents are blamed. I think about the refrigerator mom kind of scenario of blaming the parents and their interaction style and their parenting style for the difficulties that their children have. It reminded me of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. There was a section, and I just happened to find it while I was doing some reading, where he said, some localize all such problems in the adult. He's talking about not fostering any behaviors in your children that would make you resent them. And he said, some localize all such problems in the adult, whether in the parent or broader society. There are no bad children, such people think, only bad parents. When the idealized image of an unsullied child is brought to mind, this notion appears fully justified. The beauty, openness, joy, trust, and capacity for love characterizing children makes it easy to attribute full culpability to the adults on the scene. He goes on to discuss the equally difficult challenge and seductive challenge of blaming society, Jaco, to your earlier point.
Yes.
And I think we need to start stepping back away from this almost what feels like a desire for perfection, perfect parents, perfect therapist, perfect children, where we used to be able to say good enough parent, good enough therapist. Why not good enough child? Why not good enough children?
Melanie Klein, right? She coined the good enough parent. That was her that was straight from her theory.
Maybe our kids are doing better than we think. Maybe they are good enough in some sense, but we need to foster that sense in them and not steal it from them.
Absolutely. And I think we're coming down to probably a good place for us to wrap for these 2 chapters.
Yeah. We'll be going over to part 3.
Part 3. Any final thoughts that anybody has, or we have more, I'm sure, to sit with, and between now and part 3 coming out, we will have some new insights, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Like what she said, maybe there's nothing wrong with our kids. That's what she said.
Yep.
Is that the next section? Okay.
That's quite serendipitous.
Yes, it
sure
is.
Great.
All right.
Thank you, guys. It was great, as usual.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you, guys.
See you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.